Right. Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2023, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Google and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, and if you have any questions for the presenter, post them there using the ID24 hashtag. Alternatively, you can put your questions directly into the YouTube chat for this particular session, and we'll collect everything together for a Q&A at the end of the talk. On that topic, a reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. So please be nice in the live chat. Now, I am delighted to be joined once again by my guest host, Mark Thiele. Mark, over to you.
Hello from my end as well. Thank you, Patrick. Yes, and welcome back to everybody who's joining us in the stream. I have the delightful and lovely task to now introduce you to our next speaker. He is living in Amsterdam and working as a developer for more than 15 years now. And since 2019, he's focusing on accessibility. His name is Erik Bednarz, and I'm welcoming you on stage, on our virtual stage. Please, a virtual round of applause for Erik. Your stage, Erik.
Thank you for the introduction, Patrick, and thank you, Mark, and thank you also for the tech support, Patrick. And thanks for everybody who's joining in, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Erik Bednarz. My preferred pronouns are they, them, or he, him. If you cannot remember, that is okay with me. I'll tell a bit about myself because you probably never have heard of me. I'm born with an amount of privileges. I'm German. I live in Amsterdam since a quarter of a century, almost as a citizen of the Union, which is very low threshold, little bureaucracy. I'm white, male presenting, in my mid-50s, and I have short, dark blonde hair. I'm also an ex-jazz musician. I graduated at the Conservatory of Amsterdam. That's how I ended up in Amsterdam. At some point, you realize that you also have to earn money. So I'm also a former web developer by now. I was working full-time from 2007 to the beginning of 2022, mostly for web agencies with huge capitalistic clients and software as a service products. I'm completely autodidactic. I was really good at HTML, CSS, ECMAScript, and the document object model. APIs, the latter two are usually just referred to as JavaScript. Nowadays, it's usually referred to Angular or React or Vue. I'm also pretty nerdy. I'm very comfortable with figuring out continuous delivery stuff and big Docker fan, but my biggest interests are really and have always been usability and accessibility. I'm talking about disability here, and my perspective is I got diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in 2021. At the end of 2021, I am a speaking autist, as you have noticed by now, which is yet another privilege. And that's not an either-or thing. Many people imagine that's quite different. I can also become pretty mute for up to an hour, which can be very awkward, especially if you give a talk. It's very nice to have a virtual talk because usually that is initiated by unpleasant microaggressions. From 2022 to the present, I'm mostly busy with do-it-yourself psychoeducation, as I call it. That psychoeducation is what is supposed to be done by your healthcare provider after, or by a therapist that your healthcare provider pays after the diagnosis. The bad thing about autism is that a lot of information that you can afford, at least if you don't find very fancy people, is really outdated up to a decade and completely based on a deficiency model. I'm very happy with the concepts of monotropism personally, which is a very simply said a way of approaching tasks and focusing your attention It's a sort of intellectual tunnel vision, you could say, and the concept of neurodiversity. I will come back to that later. Some disclaimers. I'm only speaking for myself. It's not a legal disclaimer for a company, but I don't want to repeat that in every slide. When I talk about disability, I speak about my experience of disability. When I talk about autism, I speak of my experience of autism, not anybody's else. And when I speak about being German, I speak about my experience of being German. You get the picture. I am not a good speaker. I'm curious how that will go for a long time. I'm also recovering from COVID, which I had quite recently. On top of all other problems, my throat is quite sore. Luckily, I will mostly stick to text slides. So if I start mumbling, you have a good chance to follow along there. I'm also in the middle of a major life change. I will probably, if all works out, move back to Germany soon. And so this is my first public presentation, so I'm very nervous. There might be some mentions of unpleasantries like eugenic euthanasia later on, and there might be some offensive terms used in their historical context. Just if you're very have problems with that you know. So why am I here? What I'm talking about? Now, if I look at my, or if anybody, if an outsider looks at me in my 40s, I have been quite successful, not so much before there, but I turned it around. I had all the perks of being a white male programmer, quickly moving up to a senior position, always finding a new job really quickly, and for the first time in my life also earning good money. But in the reality of it, I've been on the edge of burnout for every single day for 15 years. And people who know how that feels know how that feels. People who don't know how that feels are lucky. I hope you never find out. Retrospectively, it's really difficult to understand, but I didn't know any better. I started working really late in a proper office job. As I said, I was a musician before age 38. So if you go in your 40s to your GP and say, yeah, panic attack, burnout, what they say is, of course, yeah, that's normal. You're 40. Congratulations. You deserve that break. That wasn't quite it, of course, but I didn't know that. And keeping up appearances in public is also called autistic masking. It takes a lot of effort to keep going. And at the end of it, it's also you pay high price in terms of general health. You don't want to see my blood pressure. I was really hitting rock bottom in 2019, or at the end of 2018, maybe my last long job before the pandemic. I had really a couple of things happening. I was completely taken aback by, almost like working in a cult, I realized later. There was some flagrant racism that got some casual recognition by some people, but no consequences, same with sexism. And I was working on a product that had to comply with accessibility guidelines, laws in the Netherlands for the government. There was no recognition of the ableism. One consequence, I had really enough of that. So I thought I start my own business and focus on the accessibility, because I wanted to put a bigger focus on that. Anyway, in the start of 2091, I had some savings. I had some what we call it, employment benefits. Took some time off and really went down the rabbit hole into disability, because I never issues. That was long before my diagnosis, funny enough, because I never saw accessibility as a technical domain. Of course, there are technical things you can do and have to learn, but they are not really the essence. And thanks to monotropism, I was also busy with that all year. And when I came up for air again in 2020, that year, as we know, never ended. Nobody responded to anything anymore. If you were looking to, as a new business, I don't know, to start, get work. So I had to find a job. I, of course, tried to do that in the accessibility domain, and coming from a very spoiled position, I was really dismayed to find the accessibility industry that I encountered to be really ableist. It started with things that other people just are used to because they're not in a privileged position, like you have a job interview, you never hear back. Your phone, what's the matter? Even disclose a disability, you don't get any, you're basically ghosted, you are not there. Or I on LinkedIn, I asked a recruiter about accommodations for a position, and I could even see that a couple of people looked at my profile. I did not get any answer on that. I shortly worked for a huge government organization in the Netherlands. I had an incredibly toxic manager who was also pretty incompetent, that wasted money, basically. It's the stuff you read in the newspaper about, but you never thought you would be in the middle of it at some point. And I also experienced some social return based companies that really exploit disabled people as a business model. Pretty incredible. But that's also not a unique experience. I realized later on by talking to people online, and especially neurodivergent web developers have experienced that themselves very often. Let's try to find out why. So, big drum roll. I came to think of disability really as the MacGuffin of accessibility. That's the title of this presentation. Good thing we made it so far. I'm really fond of the Wikipedia definition of a MacGuffin, which says it is an object, device, or event that is necessary to the plot and the motivation of the characters, but insignificant, unimportant, or irrelevant in itself. Which pretty much covered exactly spot on what I had experienced a couple of times. So if we look at the relationship between disability and accessibility, which is symbiotic in a way, we also need to look and talk about power. Karl Deutsch, in his book, The Nerves of the Government, wrote famously, "To have power means not to have to give in and to force the environment or the other person to do so. Power in this narrow sense is the priority of output over intake, the ability to talk instead of listen. In a sense, it is the ability to afford not to learn." Just a bit of trivia that completely freaks me out every time. In German, Deutsch means German, and I'm German. Karl Deutsch was a Czech social and political scientist who really does my head in every time. That's a very long statement, and it's usually shortened and also not even indicated what is omitted. And the shortened version is simply, power is the ability to afford not to learn. Which is a great statement to understand why things are happening, but especially also why a lot of things are not happening. So in the context of the talk, who has power? The accessibility industry, of course, has powers. They perform audits, assign awards, offer certifications for finding jobs, organize conferences like this one, offer remediation services, do training, and of course, standardization bodies who provide all the information and the framework the accessibility industry largely works with. And then there, of course, are more other domains that have power, like the government, healthcare. But generally speaking, disabled people themselves do not have much power. So if you're looking for a real, clear, short definition of disability, that's pretty quick. That's pretty difficult because well, it gets pretty long and people disagree. There is disability studies as an academic field. And I would have really liked to keep the slides on for about 15 minutes and wonder at what point anybody starts to see white disability studies. So that's the first takeaway. If you want a takeaway from this talk, I really recommend, if you don't know it, find and read Introducing White Disability Studies, a modest proposal by Chris Bell from 2006. It's long ago, very long ago. Chris Bell, unfortunately, has been dead for quite a while. You rarely ever see it mentioned, and I really think if you plagiarize it or put another name on there, you can give, unfortunately, the same talk today, both being on topic and nobody will notice. Like civil rights, there are disability rights. And very often people use disability justice as a drop-in replacement. You preferably shouldn't, no, you really shouldn't do that. As a simple formula, you could say that if you apply an intersectional lens to disability rights, you have the starting point for disability justice. So there are, of course, from all the studying that academics do, also models of, also, of course, disabled academics. There are models of disability, a lot of them, so many that it's hard to memorize them. If you want to be certified as an accessibility professional, you must memorize them. I have one trick, it's usually, I say it's one of them, minus the human rights model, wherever that is. And that's one of the consequences when you have a single source that has power in a certain domain. Things might get erased because power is the ability to afford, not to learn. So as an abridged who's who of disability models that works for me is the medical model, which is for the gatekeepers of accommodations. If you're disabled, you have to see at some point, if you're not a billionaire, you have to see representatives of the medical model to get diagnosis again and again and again and again to apply for accommodations. Of course, there's the social model, which most people probably know, which separates disability as a social construct from the impairments. It's you could have a whole conference about the pros and cons, of course. I'm very much still in favor of it, and it's for, as I see it, disabled activists, and I think everybody who's disabled and has not surrendered to the tragedy model of disability is an activist. By that alone, congratulations. And there's the charity model that is the root in the end for the entire accessibility industry that does good for other people. But there's always room for one more model, and I would like to talk about the competition model of disability. And to make it more complicated, there's a clinical and an infighting competition model. And that really exists, actually. I'm not really making this up. I'm just giving it a label. I'm not even sure, maybe somebody else has done it as well. So let's start with the infighting. If a minority is oppressed, what usually happens at some point is that some people in the minority start to form hierarchies. And the purpose of that is to get in front of the queue and hope to be promoted at some point out of the entire queue to the real people, which is very sad, of course. I pick an example of that from the long ago that many people probably don't know. Otto Perl was a German, probably the first German, at least significant disability activist in the Weimar Republic, in Germany as a whole. He also in German history as a whole, he published a book he wrote a book that was published, and he spearheaded an organization for disabled people to fight for their interest. And that is all very good. It's great. But he also subscribed to the popular view that, and I'm coming to the popular part from the historical context, that disabled people, and it was, as it was called then, usually cripples, and because of the World War I, before the Weimar Republic, war cripples dominated the picture on the street. They dominated the picture, the visual perception of disability in Germany. And many of these people, of course, before the war were productive members of society, had a job. And then they came back out of the war disabled. And of course, it's reasonable to say these people can become productive again when they're being helped. The flip side of that, as it is always when you help a subgroup of people, they are the remaining people who do not belong to that group. And also that is, back then, neither cripple nor war cripple nor idiot was a controversial offensive term. Those were medical terms even. The idiots were not really useful to society, and that was even thought by people in the disability community, because they were mostly useless eaters. Now, if you don't know much about the First, but also the Second World War in terms of how psychiatry was affected, an unfathomable amount of people starved to death in psychiatric institutions. There's a book about that by Heinz Faustich that I forgot to put in here. I think I have to keep this shorter. Anyway, there was a concept of useless eaters, and even more scathing, some people in the medical world said we treat them with vitamin E for euthanasia, which means you starve to death, because one of the most terrible weapons in war that is often forgotten is food and the lack of food. Another infighting domain is my turf, autism. Now, if you look at disabilities and minority, if you divide disability into physical and mental, and you think of mental as the minority, then in autism you have the minority, high functioning versus low functioning, which are dated terms, but still used. I heard them on a conference just a few weeks ago. That trickles down, and there are autistic people who self-apply them, with which is all nice. You want to promote yourself forwards, get a job, and so on, but you also, of course, say that other people are less. Then you have the reverse, like what's called autism warrior parents, who look like autistic people who have grown up, got a job, maybe became academics, and they say, you're not autistic enough, you're not as severely or profoundly autistic as my child, which is ludicrous. People grow up. And then there is the exaggerated, unspeakable top points of high-functioning autism, which is SB supremacy, based on Asperger syndrome diagnosis, which is just really what you think it is when you hear supremacy. Now, very quickly, Wikipedia says disability can be cognitive, developmental, intellectual, mental, physical, or sensory, or a combination. To me, that never made a lot of sense, because if you talk about sensory disabilities, is that a specialization or something else? It is never really made clear. There are different causes. For example, blindness as a sensory disability. Everything can happen. You can lose maybe your eyesight, but you can be born without eyeballs. I mean, can it be less physical? This really never made any sense to me, actually, this kind of categorization. And in disabilities studies, also the concept of the body-mind, that is not very popular in the Western world, but in other parts of the world, came back as a more unified way to look at a person, and that makes much more sense to me than the big diversion. So if you talk about being disabled or able and having access or having no access, you realize it is really hard to explain that unless you conform to very simple idioms. What you see here is a picture. The relation that's related to this talk, I was on a multi-day bicycle trip. And this picture was taken on the last day of the deadline to submit a talk proposal. So this is a camping ground. We see green grass surrounded by trees, a one-person tent without an outer shelter. It's probably nice weather. We see blue sky. There's a bicycle lying in front of it. It looks very romantic. And later, when it started to get dark, I wrote on my phone the description of the talk, as you might have read it before you joined the presentation, or not. You don't need to. So this was one day before I traveled there, We see a map with a GPS path. I started somewhere in the Netherlands, north of Venlo, and from the northwest, it goes down to the southeast, and it's 160 kilometer, give and take, for a scale somewhere around 110 kilometer. There's a red circle on this map. It was the first 110 to the red circle were not very steep. There was an annoying headwind, but it was all very doable. Now there's the red circle, and I have to say I'm a bicyclist. I'm used to riding long and far with luggage. This isn't even that long. Many people I know, normal people, non-disabled people, would say, "This is impossible. I cannot do that. I need a car to do that." For me, it's not really was not really difficult. But I came to Düsseldorf. And this is you cannot read it on this picture. It's a close up in the map over the River Rhine, just north of Düsseldorf. You cannot read the name, but it is the Theodor Heuss Bridge. I remember that because I was almost incapable of passing it. And I was in the middle and I was starting to panic because I had biked 110 kilometers, I had to go further. I had no idea where to spend the night. Otherwise, I was from one moment to the other, the sensory overload of the whole situation. As the wind stood at the time, the noise from the cars that were passing over the bridge, the light, everything together, I was very close to either turn around and cry or to get off and bang my head against the side rails and be taken away by an ambulance. I managed to struggle over, and then I took a break. This just to illustrate, I just get back for the scale. Almost all of this was really easy, and there are like 200 meters in here. That is almost impossible. And the thing is, most people cannot imagine, and because they cannot imagine, they also don't believe that if you tell them. But there's a lot of physical spaces in the built world, as it call it in universal design, that I cannot access because of that, or that I have to leave after I have successfully accessed them because something happens, music that really makes me get a meltdown if I would stay there. So I want to talk about the visibility of disability because of that, and I'm just going to do a voluntary commercial break. Unrelated, unaffiliated, the book Disability Visibility by Alice Wrong, edited by Alice Wrong. She's fantastic. If you don't have it, buy it and read it. It's great. It's a compilation of disabled experiences by very different people. Really, it's in that domain, just getting disabled experiences narrated by different people, not only the people you know, is really great. So invisible disability is often used as a label in what I would call infomercials that tell you things like there are situational disabilities, or there are temporary disabilities, and there are invisible disabilities. You could also represent that with a CSS selector for laughs. Maybe it's not that funny. I have gone through the slides now a couple of times. I don't find it funny anymore. Now it's too late. But to me, that's really fantasy. My overlord is psychiatry for my diagnosis. I'm owned by psychiatry, if you want. Psychiatric disorders are considered invisible disabilities. And it's a simplified statement, but you can, it holds true for the most of it. The diagnostic tool of psychiatry is observation. So invisible disabilities can be diagnosed by observation. Let that sink in and see if it makes sense to you. So, of course, invisible disability can exist in all kinds of forms. In a fleeting state, a wheelchair user sits behind a massive desk. You do not see the wheelchair. The disability is invisible. Or you meet me on the street and I'm not flapping my arms in any accelerated fashion, and you don't notice anything. And you think, You don't even notice me. I'm normal. It's invisible. But as a generic concept, I really think the invention of invisible disability legitimizes discrimination of people with mental disabilities, because it is the exit door saying, I did not know. We did not know. Now, the great Sarah Ahmed has once developed the concept of the stranger that she often uses in her book, at least a couple I read, or talks also I heard. And she first described it in Strange Encounters in 2000. And it goes like this. The stranger comes to be faced as a form of recognition. We recognize somebody as a stranger, rather than simply failing to recognize them. And the more often I read that, the more powerful it becomes. Because for disabled people, behaving strange means being recognized as a stranger. And ableism is the power of estrangement. We are not simply a stranger, we are not congenitally a stranger. Somebody with power can make you a stranger, like psychiatrists who apply the clinical gaze. They are observers with power. And of course, if you do not have power, the less power you have. If you have no power, no privilege, the bigger the chance that somebody can just make you the stranger. And even by accident, because power is the ability to afford not to learn. Now, clinical competition is likewise is the competition of being owned. As I said, my overlord is psychiatry, jokingly. I wasn't joking. There is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, by the American Psychiatric Association. And there's the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, the ICD, by the World Health Organization, which I like to call the WHO, because that's my generation. Now, this is a good example how power meets violence. If you look at the most, no, at least for me, the most notorious diagnosis, Asperger's syndrome, it was added to the DSM in 1994 and the ICD, both 1994. It was obsoleted from the DSM in 2013 and from the ICD in 2022. That's 9 years difference. And you have to know that the ICD is first accepted, and then it comes into effect. So it was accepted in 2019, comes in effect 2022. Now, Asperger syndrome has a bad rep because of misogynism ties, and Asperger is also considered complicit with the Nazis' idea of extinction of what they called life unworthy of life. And that is now citable in academic publishing, because 2018, Hans Scheck published an article about that with very conclusive evidence. Yet in 2023, I'm moving back to Germany. I did not know, although the ICD-11 is in effect, Germany still uses the ICD-10 German modification, which to me is incredible. I mean, make yourself uncomfortable. The Netherlands and Germany share a border and the problematic history of World War II. German and Dutch people are both citizens of the Union and can, as they wish, work, live, or both in their respective countries without further bureaucratic ado. In the Netherlands, the DSM is used. And Asperger syndrome as a diagnosis has been obsolete for 10 years, and its origin is tightly coupled to the military occupation by the Nazis in the Big War. And psychiatry, we're talking about marginalized people who are vulnerable and fragile. How is this even possible? Psychiatry really does not care, because power is the ability to afford not to learn. So inclusion as an industry also, I found, has a climate of fear. Just very recently, last week, Liz Jackson wrote on LinkedIn, just got another private direct message from a total stranger who won't engage publicly with my work. Love your commentary. I don't want to comment publicly because I'm looking for work. Do these folks not realize how offensive this is? That I'm in need of work too? I realize how offensive it is, but there's so much in this. If you so much subtext in this. If you don't know Liz Jackson, they are activist, famous co-author of the Disability Dongle paper. If you don't know it, find it, read it. It's fantastic, and is very critical of performative inclusion, especially everything performative, and also awards, how awards hide other things, you know, like Amazon gets awarded, gets an award for accessibility features while they're doing really bad things at the same time. Anyway, this is really, and of course you are a person, it's a private person who engages in a fight, if you want, in activism, and the opponents are big and powerful. So as another takeaway, follow and engage with Liz Jackson if you do not yet. And again, please make yourself uncomfortable, because when people bring up, whenever also in other domains, bring up controversial topics, they often hear, this discussion really makes me uncomfortable. And what you should realize is, really realize is, discomfort comes from power and privilege. It's the armchair, your discomfort in your armchair. And people who have no power, no privilege are not uncomfortable. They're either scared shitless or they find the courage to fight. That's their reality. And just as an apropos of nothing, accessibility and power in accessibility is also when some faceless automated accessibility warehouse uses a frivolous lawsuit to harass an individual practitioner for their evidence-based opinions in public discourse, or when a faceless certification warehouse follows the money and sells smoke screens to the aggressor, or when your membership really makes you uncomfortable. Some good stuff. I must check the time because I have done something wrong. Neurodiversity has become very popular. I'm a big fan of it. It really helps you, especially if you're neurodivergent. Next slide, to get a positive picture of yourself. But neurodiversity is also at risk to become so popular that it is constantly used wrong. So simple fact, what is neurodiversity? Every person has a unique mind. There's nothing controversial about it. Even the euthanasia, forced involuntary euthanasia of the Nazis is in favor of neurodiversity, because everybody has a unique mind, and the ones with the wrong unique mind must be disposed of. Neurodiversity, again, the word itself, the concept, it is neutral. It's simply a fact. It is not a group of people. It is especially not one person. That's impossible. One person cannot be diverse. It's just a fact of life. And then there's the neurodiversity paradigm, which says that different minds are valuable to society. And valuable is really essential here, because it's not about accepting. It's not about saying, okay, you are there, you're weird, but you're there, we accept it because we are a very nice society. No. Different minds are valuable. They contribute to society. It's the E in DEI, equity. And neuronormativity is just a culturally constructed concept, just as race and gender is considered now. I forgot to drink. And then there's the neurodiversity movement, which is basically social justice activism. So from that comes neurodivergent, which was coined by Kassiane Asasumasu in 2000. And that means the diverging minds, all of them covering the congenital neurominorities as autism or attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and acquired neurological conditions like Alzheimer, Parkinson, traumatic brain injury. And then there's the not so good stuff. There's the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Accessibility Task Force, which I at some point noticed in passing, and only after my diagnosis really looked again in detail from a completely different perspective. With a really long name, they use two different abbreviations on the same page, COGA-TF and Cognitive A11Y-TF. Maybe change that. Divergent people have a hard time dealing with that stuff. And then it goes on in the work statement to say that it includes cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, neurodiversity, intellectual disabilities, and so on. I think neurodiversity, this is basically either a gross misunderstanding of what neurodiversity is, or just says, yeah, people, but yeah, but we'd also say the Scottish, or the Scottish and the English, and Wales, the Welsh, and the Germans, and the Austrians. This does, to me, really make not much sense. The entire point of neurodiversity is being about everybody, not just the weirdos. Neurodiversity is society. Otherwise, you don't need any new concepts. We're constantly taking new words and making them the same that we already had. So if you look for cognitive disability, I'm a big fan of Web Accessibility in Mind. They have really good resources. Their cognitive disability article appears to have been copied a lot, I think. I'm not picking on them here in particular. And the following is just really what I think is sort of a source where a lot of people get misconceptions about cognitive disability from. So what they write is a cognitive disability, also known as intellectual disability, is a nebulous term describing a person who has greater difficulty with mental tasks than the average person. Cognitive disabilities are by far the most common type of disability. Now, the first sentence without the parentheses is really great, as far as I'm concerned. Cognitive disability is a nebulous term. I would print it on a T-shirt and wear it every day. Now, unfortunately, it continues to say cognitive disabilities can be thought of in functional or clinical terms. I agree with that. Clinical diagnoses include autism, what? Down syndrome, traumatic brain injury, what? Clinical diagnosis of cognitive disabilities, which is the same as intellectual disabilities we just learned. What? Now, if you look into clinical diagnosis, read the fucking manual, as in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, neurodevelopmental disorders and neurocognitive disorders are two entirely different categories. I'm not listing all the real diagnoses here, just some of them, because the slides would get unreadable. So neurodevelopmental disorders are intellectual development disorders. The artist formerly known as the R word, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, a vast amount of specific and unspecified learning disorders. And then neurocognitive disorders are almost only acquired disorders by disease like Alzheimer, Parkinson, HIV, and delirium for all kinds of reasons. To mix all this up is really sloppy, and I find that, to be honest, quite insulting, because it really does not make any sense. So I'm just going to read this out verbatim again. Apparently nobody ever asked in that whole process, isn't there a single universal umbrella term for everybody with a congenital or acquired neurological differences whom the task force wants to address that is not controversial, ambiguous, or insulting? And yes, there is. It is called neurodivergency. And why is that not used? Because power is the ability to afford not to learn. And in conclusion, I hope you remember the nationality of Karl Deutsch, because you have read his famous quotes so often. And I do not intend to be offensive to anybody, of course. The usual reply when you start talking about things like this is the statement, but we mean well. And I believe that, actually. And do mean well as well. Please do better. This slide is intentionally left blank, and I finished my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was a lovely talk, particularly following on from Donna's previous talk. I think where we've kind of hit a particular groove in our lineup today, and yeah, just amazing. Mark, I think we're a bit short on time, unfortunately, for questions. Mark, anything on YouTube?
On YouTube, it's a lot of praise for the talk. Everybody was like, as well as on Mastodon, as well, saying
Excellent.
like it's a hard talk, like a bit like a smack in the face, but like well needed, you know, like and therefore, yeah, I guess that was well received. Thank you, Eric, especially as you are not in the best condition, as you said, right? So I hope your source wrote.
It's a combination. The slide, the blank slide at the end is really the content of my head right now. I'm completely empty.
Oh, but you gave us lots of great points there.
Absolutely,
I mean, so many quotable bits in your slide. I realized as we were going through your talk that I had neglected to post anything from the Inclusive Design account itself. Too many plates to spin at the same time, but yeah, definitely the power is the I can't remember it now. The ability to not the ability not to afford to learn.
Afford not to learn.
Not to learn.
Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah. Sorry,
that's the one.
But yeah, that
quoted, yes.
That stuck out to me. But you know, so many quotable bits and so right. I think you know, it was powerful. It came from the heart, from your point of view, and as Mark said, it's things that needed to be said. I think so. Great stuff. Great stuff.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear that. I was a bit nervous.
Oh, don't
no
be,
reason
don't
to.
Be.
No, it is often this. I also know. I mean, I also know a lot of people who work in the accessibility industry, and it's very easy to confuse attacking institutions with attacking the people who are somehow representing those institutions.
Yeah,
I mean, those
absolutely.
are two different things, but it's very easy to be personally or feel or even be personally attacked. Of course, I don't want that, not at all.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure it will be taken in the, well, I hope so. It will be taken in the spirit that it was intended. But no, I absolutely agree. That is, I mean, from my own experience, you know, I wouldn't say I have a disability, but when I comment on things, you know, when I see developers doing certain things, you know, for the good of whatever particular group they identified as wanting to help. And as soon as you kind of mention, wow, that's not quite right, you should talk to them, often they get very defensive and they go, well, I'm only doing it, you know, to help. And
yeah, to help. Exactly.
Why are you against it? You know, is it not better that I try to do this? And it's like, no, that's not the point. It's like, you know, don't assume and don't, you know, label people and don't just go off, you know. I mean, it's the classic nothing about us without us. But no, absolutely great stuff. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Otherwise, I'm sure we could talk for another hour on this. It was a great topic. I really, really enjoyed it, and it looks like our audience out there as well really did.
I see many people bookmarking the talk already, so they're saying like showing it to local co-workers and stuff. So well done. Thank you,
excellent.
Eric.
Yes, I will try to, I totally forgot about that. I will try to make a short compilation of linking to things I mentioned that go in further detail, for example.
Excellent. That would be great. Yeah, and we'll like boost it from ours.
The neurodiversity slide is like a very short version of Nick Walker's webpage by Nick Walker, who also has a book that is even more diverse. I think that's good to know for context. I just I find it really useless to put hyperlinks printed in slides because that just creates visual noise and that's not really
yeah. And people try to type them, and then just as they're halfway through, you go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we're going to have to wrap up. So once again, thank you very much.
I haven't stopped sharing. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, your blank slide was valiantly showing there. So for the audience at home, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and be kept up to date with any future events and videos. Now, Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters, Google, Intopia, Barrier Break, Tetralogical, Intuit, InfoAxia, the law office of Laney Feingold. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour in about 8 minutes or so with our next session. So hopefully we'll see you then. So once again, thank you very much and have a great one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.